So when I developed the CAS2, I wanted to create different versions of the test that could be used in different contexts. So the rating scale is filled out by teachers. In fact, is actually used by teachers if they want to use it. And as I said, I've been training teachers in PASS theory now for years, and they love it. It changes their whole view on how students learn. And they get the rating scale and they use it. The CAS2 brief you can use like a K-bit or a RIAS or any of those kind of 20-minute, you need a quick look. A lot of special ed folks are using the 20-minute version to get for instructional purposes, like the boy with the low successive because of his handwriting. You see that kind of a score and you'd say right away, bring the school psych in here, give the full test and determine that child really has a severe disability that no one's identified before. Let's do the right thing now, right? And then the CAS2 core is 40 minutes. It's 8 subtests, the first 2 in each of the 4 scales. The CAS2 full version, 3 in each of the 4 areas, has supplementary scales if that's of interest to you. And of course, we have the CAS2 Spanish. So I really wanted to build out the different ways of getting measurement of the theory. And we also have online scoring and report writing. So I wrote a report for every possible combination of scores. It was a long report. But it's inexpensive and it's unlimited. Once you get the subscription, you can use it as much as you want. And you can cut and paste and download and customize as you see fit. It takes all the grunt work out of it, so to speak, right? The CAS2 brief is really cool. I actually have the instructions for administration on the record form. And as I mentioned, the CAS2 rating scale. Get my CAS2 Essentials book that Tulio and I wrote. That has so much information in it. Lots and lots of case studies. Big section on intervention. And I'm going to show you a few pieces from that in a few minutes. But let's get a little research update and then we'll take some more questions. I've been working in this area of test fairness from the beginning because, as I mentioned to you, I noticed when I first started being a school psychologist that something wasn't right with my tests. It wasn't fair for certain kinds of kids. And there's a really funny nuance about test fairness that you need to understand well. Because sometimes people will say, well, we took all the bias out of the test. But there's a difference between psychometric test bias and equitable assessment. And if you read the Standards of Educational and Psychological Testing manual, they make it very clear that if a person has had limited opportunities to learn the content in a test of intelligence, that test may be considered unfair because it penalizes students for not knowing the answers. Now, here's the important part. Even if the data, norming data, do not demonstrate test bias. So when you hear someone say, oh, we analyzed our test and there's no test bias, and they never report mean score differences by group, what they're doing is they're ignoring the equitable assessment part of the standards. And I've heard people do this. I've heard people from prestigious universities doing this, and it really irritates me because it's misleading, and I think it's at least disingenuous, and it hurts kids. No, that's not what I want to do here. So here's what I learned from pulling together all the evidence that I could get on all these different tests. And Tulio and I put this in our book. So you see the kind of black-white differences you get on all these tests in the yellow shaded boxes. And you see what you get with the KBC. This progression goes all the way down to the CAS2, the smallest difference between race groups, CAS2. because we measure more than anyone else measures. So there's more strengths in the total score. And we don't measure what kids don't know, right? We're not penalizing them for not knowing, not having a good vocabulary. This is a lot of studies. They're all documented in my book. I think it speaks volumes, but there's even more. Here's a study that I published looking at Hispanic and non-Hispanic children on the past theory. Same small difference as with blacks and whites. And then when Tulio and I gave the CAS2, well, when Tulio gave the CAS in English and Spanish in counterbalanced order, you get the same scores, whether you give it in English or Spanish. We published this paper, and then we replicated it, because, you know, replication is important, got the same results. And the really interesting thing is when you look at, do they have a strength and weakness in PASS, over 90% of the time you get the same answer. And you may not know this, but there's a really interesting court case having to do with gifted kids, where in a district, and actually it was U46 in Chicago, in Elgin, Illinois, in a district that had 42% of the district population was Hispanic, but only 2% of the kids in gifted were Hispanic. Obviously something's wrong, right? Well, to make a long story short, the judge ruled that the district intentionally discriminated, violated the Hispanic children's civil rights, because they required everyone to have high verbal and math scores in order to get into gifted. Even though they gave my Naglieri nonverbal, and even if they had a really high score on my nonverbal, the district still wouldn't let them in. I think this has implications for what we do as school psychologists, because we do this all the time. I hear this all the time in gifted. Well, we have to give the WISC in Florida, for example. Well, we screen with a COGAT, which is just a group administered WISC, which is laced with knowledge. And then they have to give a WISC after that. Well, double whammy there. Now, I want to just talk about CHC cross battery for a second. What's it based on? It's based on Cattell and Horn's notions of whatever all those factor analyses told them. I don't know if you know about this, but there's a lot of research now that says you should not ever interpret beyond the total score, because all the parts don't have enough specific variance to be interpreted. This is a real problem for those guys. It's a problem for the CHC, it's a problem for the WJ, it's a problem for cross battery, because what they're saying is there's not enough power in those scores. I'm not exaggerating. This is not even half of the research studies that have been done. Now, I want you to know, I know these people, right? If I didn't think that they were trustworthy, I wouldn't accept what they found, but I do. They're good, honest people who are trying to help us understand what we have. They've studied the Stanford Binet, the WISC in different languages, the WJ cognitive, you know, the Canadian WISC, the Spanish WISC, the blah, blah. They go on and on and on and on. But you know what's really amazing, for me anyway? They did the same analysis with my cognitive assessment system and didn't get the same result. They found that the part scores, the PASS scores, do have enough variance to be interpreted. I took a risk. I gave Gary Canavay, somebody who I've known for decades now, when I had my CAS standardization data, I said to him, Gary, I just want to know what is. Just do what you do and tell me. And I'll accept whatever you find. And he did. And it's not the same. Why isn't it the same? Because all that other stuff is the same Army Alpha in another package, in another way to interpret, 101 ways to interpret block design, 90 ways to interpret coding. They mix and match a little from this test, a little from that test, put it all together, come up with an answer. Well, that's not what I think we should be doing. We need to leave the past behind. We need to look to brain-based conceptualizations, not based on, what did John Carroll do with all those factor analyses? You just factor analyze what we had already. But, like I remember having a conversation with Bob Sternberg a long time ago, well, you get out of factor analysis what you put into it. Everybody knows that. Well, we got out of factor analysis what we put into it, PASS. What I'm telling you is you can interpret those PASS scores. And notice I keep saying PASS, not subtests. I don't think we should ever do subtest analysis on any test. I've been saying that for decades. I used to teach my students, never do subtest analysis on the WISC or anything else. It's too much evidence that doesn't work. Joe Gluting and Paul McDermott showed that in 1990. Doesn't work. I don't care what anybody says. The evidence is clear. Doesn't work. So what do you do on the CAS? You're not going to do subtest analysis on the CAS. We have a theory. We have 4 important cognitive processes. That's what you do. So now your question to me should be, is there any evidence that PASS profiles matter? Right? That's a good question. I'm going to answer it for you. But how do we answer that question? Well, we go and we say, what's the research, like I did on race differences, right? What is the research? We pull it all together. I've pulled it together in several different places. You can get copies of these articles on my website. And now this is a complicated slide. I'm going to walk you through it together. We'll look at it together. So this is the WISC-5, the WISC-4, the WJ, the KBC, and the CAS. I went to the manuals of these instruments and pulled out the studies that showed the profiles by the scales for children with reading decoding failure. Notice it's not learning disabilities, it's specific learning disability. In this case, a dyslexia, a child with dyslexia, reading decoding failure. So what does the WISC-5 tell us? Not a whole lot. A little bit of low on the working memory if you really think that's working memory. I don't think it is, but notwithstanding, not an issue. The WISC-4, WISC-5, basically the same. What about the WJ? Just a weird profile where kind of everything's 90 and above. So is there a disorder in processing being rendered there? I don't think so, right? What about the KBC? I was really disappointed in the KBC, honestly, because I worked on the first one and I hoped it would work, but it doesn't. And then what about the CAS? Wow, look at that. That's crazy. Kids with reading decoding failure really have temporal lobe problems, which is why they can't do our successive processing. Now, is this enough information? No. We need to have another group and see if we get a different profile. And if you think about the students that we have traditionally struggled with, ADHD versus LD, right? So let's look at kids who have ADHD. What do they look like on these profiles? I did the same thing for those individuals. So students with ADHD, area WISC scores, well, that's not telling you anything. Well, Russ Barkley and Kevin Murphy and George DePaul have been saying that for years. You don't get anything out of a WISC that helps you understand if there's anything cognitively happening with a student with ADHD. And the WJ looks kind of familiar. The KBC, just kind of flat. But look at the CAS. Now, wait a second. Children with attention deficit are not low on attention? That's right. What are they low in? What we call executive function. Frontal lobes, what I call planning. What Russ Barkley talks about all the time. It's a frontal lobe syndrome, you could call it. I think it's a specific learning disability, actually, because it's a disorder in one or more basic psychological processes. Think about it, right? I mean, it is just as viable a disorder as a low successive processing. Now, I will tell you, that inattentive type of children, the attention and the planning scores flip. So attention is lower and planning is higher, but inattentive type. That was a study we have out of from Stefano Tade. And any case, but I want to show you one more. I'm going to superimpose these two sets on each other and just point out a few things. So let's start from the right and go to the left. Look at the CAS. Look at the difference between these profiles for these individuals. Wow, that's really startling. The CAS helps us see the cognitive role that is playing out with children with ADHD and the cognitive explanation for reading decoding failure really beautifully. KBC, not much happening. WJ, wow. If you're doing cross battery so you can get all those CHC factors, I would suggest that the WJ doesn't differentiate these individuals very well at all. I'm still waiting to get evidence from, about how these other tools measure any better. And look at the WISC-4 and the WISC-5. The only thing that seems to happen here with the children with reading disabilities, a little bit low on working memory. So how can we understand that? Well, let's think about the working memory scale has digit span. And so digit span forward, well, that is a lot of dependency on successive processing. Now, digits backwards, we know from the article by Schofield and Ashman in 1986 in the journal Intelligence, measured successive and a little bit of planning, so it's very confounded. And the other subtests in the working memory scale, whatever those might be measuring. So I think that's probably like a little bit of a influence there, but really not enough to really rely on. So yeah, we get distinctive profiles. And there's a lot of profile research. Core profiles for the standardization sample, profiles for children who have reading comprehension problems that are different from children who have reading decoding problems. There's a lot of profile research that's out there. And one of the first ones that I did, I actually showed that if you wound up in special ed before the CAS was published, and we had a group of children who we tested during standardization, those students who wound up in special ed were 4 times as likely to have a weakness in one of the basic psychological processes on the CAS than regular kids. So it was an unselected cohort, meaning they were placed before my test came along. We tested them after they were placed, and then we found out these kids have problems. Now, sometimes we have to back up and say, okay, we looked at profiles, we see the factor analysis stuff. What about some basic validity? Like, what's the most basic evidence of validity that you have? Correlations to achievement. Well, in order to answer that question, I'm kind of working against myself if I compare a WISC to a CAS, because the WISC has knowledge in it, right? So you have criterion contamination. But I did it anyway. And look what we find. CAS, the WISC-5 correlation with the Y at 0.53. But if we take out the verbal comprehension scale and just look at the average of the scales that were remaining, it goes down to 0.47. And we did the same thing with these other tests, but it doesn't really matter. Because ultimately, no matter how you look at it, the CAS always correlates the highest with achievement. So in other words, those profiles that we just saw, the influence of those profiles really shows up in the influence on these correlations. And notice the sample size in that study, 1,600 students, ages 5 to 18, who represent the US population. That's a powerful study. And you know what usually happens, the bigger your sample, the smaller the correlation coefficient, because the error variance goes down. And we really, we just really did good here when we saw this. But what really got me was this next study that I didn't do. It's published by George Giorgio and his colleagues. They did a meta-analysis on all the studies that looked at the relationship between PASS scores and achievement. And here's what they found. The correlations are significantly stronger than the correlations reported in previous meta-analyses for all other measures of intelligence. Wow. That says a lot. And they concluded if we conceptualize intelligence as cognitive processes that are linked to functional organization of the brain, it leads to significantly higher relations with academic achievement, and the processes have direct implication for instruction and intervention.